Let's turn our attention to the final argument that Rachel presents in this chapter that purports to give us reasons to accept ethical egoism. Now, the last argument he refers to as ethical egoism as compatible with common sense morality. So, the idea behind this argument is that there's an ordinary common sense conception about what's the appropriate moral thing to do, the correct thing to do, ethically speaking. And that is contained in a bunch of moral precepts, duties that common sense recognizes. So, commonsensically, we have a duty not to lie to each other for no good reason. Commonsensically, we have a duty not to harm others arbitrarily. Commonsensically, we have a duty to keep our promises to each other. So, ordinarily, when we're acting as ethical agents, we seem to adhere to these kind of rules. Now, acting in our everyday life, we seem to adhere to these rules, but these rules don't have any sort of clear cut motivation, and they don't have any connection or unification into a coherent system. And so, this argument suggests that ethical egoism is a good ethical normative theory precisely because it both explains why it is that we should adhere to these dictates, and it unifies these dictates by providing a common explanation for why it is that we have these duties and not other duties. Why do we have the duty not to lie as opposed to the duty to lie? Why do we have the duty not to harm others, but we don't have the duty to travel to Mars? All right. So the idea here is that ethical egoism will explain why it is that we have these particular common sense dictates about how we should behave, and it'll explain what they have in common, why it is that we have these dictates and not others. And how's that supposed to work? Well, let's take the case of the duty not to lie. The idea in this argument is that the duty not to lie is motivated by, is explained by our own self-interest. So we have a self-interest in remaining or adhering to this dictate that we should be truthful in our pronunciations, in our interactions with people. And why? Well, it benefits us because not lying means that people can trust us. And so we generate trust amongst individuals. It facilitates easy and reliable information exchange between individuals. If people randomly lied to each other, we couldn't depend on what they tell us as being good information. And so it promotes that as well. And it promotes commerce, right? We can trust other people, we can believe what they say, hence we can engage with them, form contracts and exchange goods for services and so on, right? So that's how this argument purports to explain each of these individual common sense duties. They are, in fact, dictates of self-interest. And because ethical egoism and self-interest can both explain each of these individual duties and then unify them by providing a common motivation for them, it is the best ethical theory and therefore is likely to be true. Now, Rachel's rejects this argument. He says this is maybe the best attempt to come up with an argument in support of ethical egoism, but he thinks there are two crucial flaws. The first flaw is ethical egoism can explain why it's prudential, why it's in our self-interest to adhere to particular dictates from common sense morality, like not lying. So it gives us reasons not to lie, right? To adhere to that rule. But it doesn't explain why this is the right thing to do. And we can see that by looking at cases where it's in our self-interest to lie to people. Now, our common sense duty tells us that we shouldn't lie even when it's in our own self-interest. So I can maybe, get $5 by lying to you about how much something I bought for you costs. Right? and that would be in my self-interest. Now, according to ethical egoism, that's the morally correct thing for me to do. But according to our common sense moral dictates, I have a duty not to lie to you, even though it would profit me. And so ethical egoism can explain why sometimes it's prudent for us to adhere to these conventions in common sense morality. But it can't explain why they're conventions, why it is that we should adhere to them when they are in opposition to our own self-interest. And so it can't actually explain and unify these dictates of common sense or ordinary moral precepts. In addition to that, Rachel suggests that even in those cases where it provides us with a reason or a motivation for acting in accordance with these precepts, that is ethical egoism, specifically dictates that that's the only motivation that we could have, the only morally correct reason for doing these things. But it's far from clear, Rachel says, that in these cases, that's our only motivation, or even the motivation that makes these actions morally correct for us. And so he suggests that even if we, for instance, have a self-interested reason to give relief, or to give money to famine relief, right? That will explain why it is prudential for us to do it, why it's in our self-interest to do it. But that doesn't necessarily exhaust the reasons why we should do it. And specifically, there's that important should. It doesn't necessarily tell us why it is that we ought to do it. It tells us that it's prudential for us, but it doesn't tell us why we have a responsibility to do it. And so we might have a motivation to give money to famine relief because, not that it's necessarily in our self-interest, or even if it is in our self-interest, it's also something that is morally required of us. It's the correct moral course of action. And so Rachel says then there are two problems with this argument. It really doesn't explain why these dictates are duties, doesn't unify them in accordance with a common explanation, and even in those cases where it can motivate those dictates, it doesn't provide us with the only or even the best candidate for why it is that we ought to do them from an ethical perspective. And so for these reasons, Rachel rejects this argument, even though he thinks this is the best argument for ethical egoism that he presents.